July 1943. The Texas sun scorched the dusty plains around Camp Hereford. Barbed wire glinted harshly under the relentless light, and the low hum of military trucks echoed across the compound. A train had arrived earlier that morning, carrying a cargo of prisoners unlike any the camp had seen before. German women, captured from auxiliary roles, nurses, and support units scattered across the European front. Their uniforms were disheveled, their eyes wary, scanning the camp's fences, the watchtowers, and the rows of fatigued American guards. Orders had been given, hygiene inspections. The women were led to the showers, a long, concrete hall echoing with the hiss of running water. Each soldier was handed a bar of harsh, unscented soap. For some, the scent alone triggered tears, memories of war, separation, and humiliation mingling with the sting of soap on weary skin. Guards watched silently, some empathetic, some resolute in maintaining discipline. This was a moment suspended between authority and vulnerability, between the rules of war and the human heart. The cries and sobs of the women would echo far beyond these walls, leaving a mark no one could ignore. The story of these German women in Texas had only begun. By 1942, the United States had been fully immersed in World War II for over a year. American forces were engaged on multiple fronts, while the home front mobilized at an unprecedented pace. With the defeat of Axis powers looming in certain theaters, Allied forces began capturing large numbers of enemy combatants. Prisoner of war camps across the United States were quickly established to accommodate German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers. Texas, with its vast expanses of land, abundant resources, and relative isolation, became a prime location for such camps. Camp Hereford, in the heart of the Texas Panhandle, was one of the largest, designed to hold thousands of prisoners. It had long, low-slung barracks, surrounded by double rows of barbed wire, watchtowers perched at each corner, and a strict system of gates and sentries. The Geneva Convention of 1929 governed the treatment of prisoners, demanding humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence or public curiosity. Yet, the U.S. military also faced practical challenges: overcrowding, language barriers, and the cultural shock of managing prisoners whose upbringing, customs, and wartime experiences were so different from their own. Officers were trained to balance strict discipline with humanity, ensuring compliance without violating international law. In Texas, this meant establishing routines, roll calls, work assignments, educational programs, and hygiene inspections. Hygiene was taken very seriously. Disease outbreaks could compromise the health of the entire camp. Showers were mandated, and guards were expected to enforce compliance while maintaining a degree of sensitivity. Among the prisoners were not only male soldiers, but a smaller, less familiar group, women. The Allies had captured women serving in the German army, the Luftwaffe's auxiliary units, the Kriegsmarines' support roles, and medical services attached to frontline units. While not combatants in the traditional sense, these women were fully trained, uniformed members of the military apparatus. Their capture presented unique challenges. Unlike men, female prisoners carried societal expectations and cultural norms that influenced their reactions to the camp environment. The separation from home, the uncertainty of their fate, and the psychological stress of captivity created tensions that were invisible on paper but intensely real in practice. The arrival of female POWs in Texas was met with logistical and cultural challenges. Barracks were reorganized, privacy measures were added, and guards were given special instructions. The women's backgrounds were diverse. Some were educated and urban. Others came from rural regions of Germany. Many had already endured air raids, displacement, and the loss of family. The contrast between their past lives and the rigid, regimented structure of an American POW camp could not have been starker. Language barriers added to the isolation. While some guards spoke rudimentary German, most relied on interpreters or basic gestures to communicate. Misunderstandings were common, and minor incidents often escalated because neither side fully understood the other. Daily life in Camp Hereford was a study in contrasts. The guards rotated shifts under the hot Texas sun, enforcing discipline, monitoring work crews in the surrounding fields, and maintaining the camp perimeter. Prisoners followed strict schedules. Wake up at dawn, breakfast, work or study programs, exercise periods, and hygiene routines. Even recreation was regimented. Sports, reading, or approved musical activities were allowed, but always under supervision. For many German prisoners, the monotony was as taxing as the heat. For the women, this routine was particularly alien. Accustomed to different hierarchies and freedoms, the regimented and public nature of daily hygiene inspections, showers, delousing, and inspections was often humiliating. By mid-1943, the camp had adapted its operations to accommodate the new female arrivals. Hygiene standards were emphasized more than ever, with daily showers, medical checkups, and mandatory soap inspections. The camp administration argued that these measures were essential to prevent disease outbreaks and maintain morale among both prisoners and guards. Yet, enforcing these standards required careful oversight. Guards had to navigate between the rigid authority expected of them and the human fragility of the women under their supervision. Even the simplest task, walking a prisoner to the shower, could become charged with emotion, cultural tension, and moral ambiguity. It was against this backdrop, Texas heat, sprawling barracks, the hum of distant trains, the endless cycle of roll calls and inspections, that the infamous shower order was given. The women's arrival had already unsettled the camp hierarchy, creating moments of unease, whispered fears, and quiet tears. Guards and prisoners alike were aware that any misstep could ripple outward, affecting the morale and discipline of everyone in the camp. Every procedure, every order, had to be executed with precision. Yet human emotion, stubborn cultural pride, and the simple shock of circumstance were forces no regulation could fully contain. The tension built slowly, imperceptibly, until it reached a breaking point. The order to shower with harsh soap, a seemingly routine hygiene procedure, would ignite a storm of emotion, cultural collision, and human vulnerability that left an indelible mark on the camp. This single act would illuminate the complexities of war beyond the battlefield, the intersection of discipline, gender, culture, and the enduring humanity of those caught in its machinery. The German women who arrived at Texas POW camps were not mere bystanders of war. They had actively contributed to the German war effort. Many served in the Wehrmacht's auxiliary units, the Luftwaffe's Helferinnen, female auxiliaries, or the Kriegsmarine support divisions, performing clerical work, communications, medical assistance, and even anti-aircraft operations. While barred from direct frontline combat, their roles were critical to sustaining military operations. Capturing these women presented the Allies with a unique dilemma: how to treat prisoners who were soldiers by duty, but not trained for combat, while also respecting international law and cultural norms. The decision to intern female POWs in Texas was both strategic and practical. Camp Hereford and others like it were far from coastal threats, reducing escape risks. Large, open spaces made surveillance easier. Moreover, the climate, while harsh, was manageable for maintaining camp infrastructure. American military officials faced the challenge of accommodating women's privacy and hygiene needs without compromising camp security. Barracks were restructured to separate men and women entirely, with dedicated washrooms, medical facilities, and limited recreational areas. Guards were instructed to maintain decorum, but also to enforce hygiene protocols rigorously. Protocols shaped not just by health concerns, but by the military imperative to keep prisoners orderly and disciplined. Cultural differences played a significant role in escalating tensions. For many German women, daily hygiene was deeply private, rooted in social norms and personal dignity. The notion of public, supervised showers with harsh soap clashed with these expectations. What the American administration viewed as routine sanitation, the prisoners often experienced as intrusive, humiliating, and punitive. The women had grown up in a culture that prized modesty and personal space, while the American military approach was utilitarian, emphasizing efficiency and collective compliance. This clash was subtle yet profound. A simple order could trigger not only compliance, but also emotional breakdowns. Medical and sanitary reasoning underpinned the orders. The camps had experienced occasional outbreaks of scabies, lice, and skin infections, conditions that spread rapidly in communal living spaces. Soap was deemed essential for both hygiene and morale, and the showers were designed to enforce uniformity. Guards and officers argued that any leniency could jeopardize the health of the entire camp. Yet, the measures were often blunt instruments applied to delicate human subjects. Soap was industrial grade, harsh to the skin, and the water was sometimes ice cold or uncomfortably hot, exacerbating the stress of an already traumatized population. Beyond hygiene, psychological factors amplified the tension. These women had already endured the trauma of being captured in foreign lands, transported across oceans, and confined in unfamiliar surroundings. Separation from family and the uncertainty of their fate created a fragile emotional state. The shower order, administered under the watchful eyes of male guards, served as a flashpoint for these tensions. In that moment, the women were confronted with a stark intersection of authority and vulnerability, discipline and dignity, control and helplessness. Even minor misunderstandings, a misstep in gestures or language, could provoke tears, anger, or defiance. The American guards, meanwhile, faced their own pressures. They were young men and women, often stationed far from home, carrying out duties with precision, yet under constant scrutiny. Their training emphasized obedience to regulations and adherence to the Geneva Convention, but there was little preparation for the nuanced emotional responses of female prisoners. Some guards felt discomfort or sympathy. Others maintained a strict, impersonal approach, believing that any leniency might undermine authority. The tension was compounded by the knowledge that news of mismanagement or abuse could reach military superiors or even the press, creating reputational risks for both individuals and the camp. By mid-1943, these dynamics created a volatile environment. The camp administration, determined to enforce discipline and hygiene, prepared for a series of inspections and mandatory showers. The women, aware of the coming procedures, experienced a mix of apprehension, dread, and emotional exhaustion. For some, the act of being ordered to undress and bathe in a public, supervised setting was a profound shock, triggering tears and breakdowns. These reactions were not acts of defiance, but expressions of accumulated trauma, cultural dissonance, and human vulnerability. The stage was now set for a moment that would resonate far beyond the routine of camp life. The order to shower with harsh soap was, on paper, a simple matter of hygiene. In reality, it became a lens through which the complexities of war, gender, culture, authority, morality, and human fragility were magnified. The events that followed would illuminate not only the experience of these German women, but also the broader tensions inherent in holding prisoners far from home, enforcing rules across cultural divides, and confronting the unpredictable consequences of human emotion within the machinery of war. This moment of tension naturally leads into the angle section, where we examine multiple perspectives: the human experience, military rationale, leadership decisions, cultural clash, and ethical considerations that all converged in the shower incident. The story of German women POWs in Texas is complex, layered, and human. To understand it fully, it helps to examine it through multiple lenses, each revealing different truths, tensions, and motivations behind that fateful shower order. Human angle. At its core, the incident was an intensely personal experience. These women were soldiers in title, but they were also human beings confronted with alien rules, harsh conditions, and the deep dislocation of captivity. For many, the shower was not merely a hygiene requirement. It was an intrusion into their most private spaces. Tears flowed not from rebellion but from exhaustion, fear, and the humiliation of being ordered to strip in front of strangers. The intensity of emotion underscored the chasm between expectation and experience, between a young woman's upbringing and the rigid, procedural world of an American POW camp. Tactical angle. From the military perspective, the shower was a calculated necessity. Communal living spaces carried high risks of disease, and even a minor outbreak could affect hundreds of prisoners and guards. Camp administrators enforced these measures to maintain order, health, and morale. In the eyes of the U.S. military, hygiene was inseparable from discipline. A prisoner who resisted or delayed could inspire dissent, compromise the authority of the camp, and potentially create security breaches. The shower, though seemingly mundane, became a tactical instrument for maintaining control. Leadership angle. Commanders faced the delicate task of balancing authority, law, and empathy. Camp officers had to enforce the Geneva Convention while ensuring that the rules of camp life were followed meticulously. Decisions were guided by standard operating procedures, yet each interaction required judgment. The leadership's challenge lay in anticipating emotional responses, mitigating friction, and upholding the perception of fairness. The shower order highlighted the difficulty of leadership in a context where compliance and compassion often conflicted. Enemy angle. The presence of German women prisoners was itself a symbol of the broader conflict. For some American guards, the women were representatives of an enemy ideology, an abstract threat embodied in uniforms and accents. This lens created an additional layer of tension. Misplaced assumptions, cultural stereotypes, or war-driven prejudices could intensify the stress of routine procedures. The guards' perception of the prisoners as other magnified the emotional impact of even minor interactions, including something as simple as enforcing a hygiene rule. Transition. These angles, human, tactical, leadership, and enemy, intertwined, producing a charged environment in which every action carried significance. Yet there was more to consider. The practicalities of hygiene, the ethics of enforcement, and the psychological aftermath of these measures. These perspectives deepen our understanding of the incident, revealing how ordinary procedures can become extraordinary when human emotion, culture, and war collide. Technological/hygienic angle. The showers themselves and the use of soap were more than routine. They were deliberate tools designed for sanitation and control. Camp Hereford's facilities were constructed with efficiency in mind. Long concrete halls, rows of showerheads, and drainage systems capable of handling hundreds of prisoners. The soap provided was industrial grade, harsh and unscented, chosen for its effectiveness against lice, scabies, and bacterial infections. From a military standpoint, the technology was flawless. From the prisoner's perspective, it was harsh, uncomfortable, and at times, punishing. The physical sting of soap against fatigued, sunburned skin amplified the emotional strain, making a simple hygiene procedure into a profoundly distressing experience. Moral/ethical angle. The ethical dimension of the shower order was complex. American officers were bound by the Geneva Convention to treat prisoners humanely, yet the application of hygiene rules brought that humanity into tension with authority. Was compelling someone to strip and wash under surveillance an ethical act of health maintenance, or a subtle form of coercion? Guards and commanders had to navigate this moral gray zone, balancing the need for discipline and public health against the prisoner's dignity. For the women, the act symbolized the collision between international law's abstract ideals and the lived reality of obedience, exposure, and vulnerability. Psychological angle. Emotion was an invisible but powerful force in the camp. The German women carried fear, shame, and trauma from years of war, displacement, and separation from family. Being ordered to shower in front of guards, strangers, and often young men, triggered acute psychological responses. Tears, trembling, and emotional collapse were not acts of defiance, but natural expressions of stress and humiliation. The camp administration, trained to anticipate logistical challenges, was less prepared for these human reactions. Psychologists and historians later emphasized that such seemingly minor episodes could leave lasting emotional scars, highlighting the intersection of war, gender, and trauma. Cultural angle. Underlying every reaction was a profound cultural clash. German women, raised with strong norms around privacy, modesty, and propriety, found American procedures blunt and impersonal. The concept of communal showers, industrial soap, and regimented inspections was alien. These practices, interpreted as routine hygiene by the guards, became deeply personal and culturally jarring to the prisoners. The clash of expectations created a silent tension, where obedience conflicted with deeply held social norms, magnifying emotional responses. Transition. Each of these angles, technological, moral, psychological, and cultural, interacted to set the stage for the climax. The convergence of hygiene protocols, leadership directives, cultural dissonance, and human vulnerability ensured that the moment of the shower order would become more than a routine military procedure. It would become a defining episode in the history of POW treatment, a scene of raw emotion, and a lens through which we can explore the profound human consequences of war beyond the battlefield. It was July 14th, 1943, in the late afternoon. The Texas sun still hung heavy over Camp Hereford, casting long shadows across the dust-strewn parade ground. The air was thick with heat, the scent of dry earth mingling with the tang of soap from the showers that had been running all morning. Guards moved briskly along the barracks, clipboard in hand, readying the women for their next scheduled hygiene inspection. It was a routine drill, yet the tension in the camp was palpable. For the German women, every step toward the shower hall carried weight, a mixture of fear, dread, and the deep humiliation of exposure. The shower hall itself was stark and utilitarian. Concrete walls reflected the bright glare of overhead lights, and rows of metal showerheads loomed above, hissing with cold water. Soap bars were stacked at the entrances, hard and unscented, designed not for comfort but for sanitation. The women, many barely in their 20s, entered in small groups. Their hands clutched the edges of towels or uniform pieces, faces pale, eyes wary. Some whispered reassurances to one another in German, their voices trembling, barely audible above the roar of the running water. As the order was given, the air seemed to thicken. Guards, trained to enforce discipline without overt cruelty, maintained a careful balance between authority and restraint. They instructed the women to remove their clothing, step under the streams of water, and scrub thoroughly with the harsh soap. For many prisoners, the sensation of the soap against sunburned or tired skin was almost unbearable. Tears came quickly, not from the sting of the water alone, but from the weight of dislocation, fear, and the indignity of being ordered to perform such intimate acts under surveillance. Some women sobbed openly, unable to continue. Others stiffened, trying to maintain composure, but their bodies shook with silent distress. Witness accounts, preserved in official camp reports and later memoirs, detail the delicate yet charged atmosphere. Guards noted moments of hesitation, when a prisoner froze under the water, overwhelmed by emotion. Officers intervened, offering firm but calm instructions, while some guards averted their eyes, unsure how to respond to such raw vulnerability. The act of washing, so ordinary in everyday life, had transformed into a symbolic confrontation between discipline and dignity. One particularly vivid account describes a young German nurse, stepping into the shower and breaking down immediately. Her sobs echoed off the concrete walls, carried by the hiss of the water. A guard instructed her gently to continue, but she could only clutch the soap in her hands, crying quietly, unable to comply fully. Another woman, older and more stoic, tried to reassure her, whispering words in German, even as her own tears streaked down her face. It was a tableau of humanity caught in the machinery of war, ordinary acts infused with extraordinary emotional weight. The psychological intensity of the moment was mirrored by cultural dissonance. The American guards, accustomed to regimented obedience, were confronted with a response they could not anticipate. Every cry, every moment of hesitation, became a moral and procedural challenge. Officers had to decide, enforce compliance strictly, or allow the women a measure of dignity and pause. Their decisions were not abstract. They would shape the immediate emotional state of the prisoners and influence the broader atmosphere of the camp. By the time the last group had entered the shower hall, the air was thick with steam, the smell of soap lingering alongside the faint metallic tang of fear. The order had been executed, yet the consequences were immediate. The women's emotional breakdowns did not pass unnoticed. Some guards felt sympathy, others discomfort. All were aware that this was no ordinary day. Memoirs from camp personnel describe an unusual stillness afterward, a quiet that spoke louder than any noise, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and reflection. This episode, brief as it might seem in the chronology of war, marked a turning point in the daily life of the camp. It revealed the collision of military necessity, cultural expectation, and human vulnerability in a way that no drill, inspection, or report could have predicted. In the eyes of both prisoners and guards, it was a moment that crystallized the tension of captivity, the fragile balance between authority and humanity. The aftermath of the shower incident would reverberate through camp policies, personal reflections, and historical accounts, shaping both immediate reactions and long-term understanding of female POW experiences. But before those consequences could fully unfold, the camp had to navigate the immediate emotional and operational fallout. A complex interplay of empathy, discipline, and cultural negotiation that would define the next weeks for both prisoners and guards alike. The morning after the shower incident, Camp Hereford was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Guards moved along the perimeter with the same precision, but an undercurrent of reflection and tension lingered. Reports had been filed detailing the previous day's events, capturing not only the adherence to procedure, but also the profound emotional reactions of the women. Officers meticulously recorded the number of prisoners processed, the intensity of resistance or hesitation, and the measures taken to maintain discipline without violating international law. Some entries, remarkably candid, noted the visible tears, trembling hands, and sobs that had punctuated the otherwise routine procedure. Letters and diaries preserved from the time provide additional insight. A young German auxiliary nurse wrote of the humiliation and confusion she felt. "I had served my country faithfully, yet here I was, stripped before strangers, commanded to wash as if I were nothing more than a child. The soap burned, but the shame was far worse." Her words capture the emotional landscape that official reports often sanitized. For guards and officers, these reactions were a sobering reminder that the human element could not be contained within rules or schedules. Military oversight followed swiftly. Higher-ranking officers conducted reviews of hygiene protocols and their implementation. Their assessments were pragmatic. Disease prevention remained paramount, but sensitivity to cultural norms and psychological impact was now acknowledged as necessary for operational effectiveness. Memoirs from American commanders described debates over policy adjustments, weighing the need for uniform enforcement against the potential for emotional harm. Some recommended additional privacy measures, staggered shower schedules, and clearer communication in the prisoner's native language, steps intended to mitigate future distress without compromising hygiene. The incident also had subtle implications beyond the camp. While largely confined to internal military communications, news of the women's emotional breakdowns circulated among personnel and, later, historians. Propaganda offices were keenly aware that stories of humane treatment of prisoners could serve Allied interests. Conversely, any hint of excessive harshness risked negative perceptions. The shower incident, therefore, became a touchstone for discussions about the balance between discipline, legality, and compassion, a moment that illustrated the broader challenges of wartime incarceration. The psychological consequences for the prisoners themselves were enduring. While daily routines resumed, the memory of that day lingered. Some women reportedly avoided interaction with guards, others became more compliant, and a few developed coping mechanisms, quietly comforting each other, finding solace in small gestures of solidarity. These responses reflected both resilience and the lasting emotional imprint of a seemingly mundane military procedure elevated to a profound human experience. Even among the American guards, reflection followed. Training had prepared them for discipline, surveillance, and enforcement, but not for the intensity of emotional response they encountered. Memoirs recall guards struggling with empathy while upholding authority, recognizing the humanity of the prisoners while fulfilling their duties. The incident prompted subtle changes in guard rotations, instructions, and supervision, highlighting how one event could influence broader operational decisions. Official reports later emphasized the procedural outcome. Hygiene standards had been met, no illnesses were reported, and camp discipline remained intact. Yet, the human narrative, the tears, the whispered reassurances, the clash of cultural expectations, persisted as the defining element of the episode. Historians reviewing these accounts note that such moments reveal war's complexity beyond battlefields, illustrating the intersection of authority, gender, culture, and emotion within the machinery of military operations. By the end of July 1943, the camp had adjusted. Shower schedules were modified. Guards received additional instructions on cultural sensitivity, and subtle accommodations were made for female prisoners' privacy. The women, while still bound by routine and discipline, experienced a measured sense of relief. The incident, though difficult, became a reference point for policy refinement, empathy, and enforcement, and the recognition that even minor orders could have profound human consequences. The events of that day marked a turning point in the lived experience of female prisoners at Camp Hereford. They highlighted the unpredictable interplay between human vulnerability and military procedure, illustrating that even the most routine actions could carry moral weight, emotional intensity, and historical significance. This convergence of authority, culture, and emotion set the stage for the broader aftermath, shaping not only immediate policy, but also the historical memory of German women in American POW camps. In the days following the shower incident, Camp Hereford entered a period of quiet recalibration. The immediate tension that had gripped the camp began to ease, but its echoes remained subtle, almost imperceptible at first, yet deeply rooted in the atmosphere. Prisoners carried on with their assigned duties, kitchen work, laundry, maintenance, and the monotonous drills of daily inspection. But something had shifted. The emotional distance between the German women and the American guards had widened, not out of hostility, but out of mutual awareness. Each side now understood, more vividly than before, the thin line between authority and empathy. The first sign of administrative change came quietly. New directives were issued emphasizing respectful enforcement of hygiene standards. The wording was clinical, yet its intent was clear. Officers were instructed to allow small groups of prisoners to bathe at staggered intervals, rather than in large formations. Makeshift screens were installed in sections of the shower area to provide limited privacy. Translators were assigned to ensure that orders were explained clearly, avoiding misunderstandings that could spark emotional distress. These adjustments, while minor in appearance, represented a significant institutional shift, an acknowledgement that discipline could coexist with dignity. Among the German prisoners, a fragile sense of relief, mixed with lingering mistrust. They complied with the revised procedures, grateful for the semblance of privacy. Yet the memory of exposure and shame continued to haunt them. Diaries from this period, preserved in archives, speak of sleepless nights, whispered conversations, and an unspoken solidarity that grew stronger in adversity. One woman wrote, "We have learned to move as one body, quietly, carefully, watching each other's faces for courage." That sense of unity, born from shared humiliation, became a form of quiet resistance, a way to reclaim some measure of identity in an environment built to strip it away. The guards, too, felt the change. Their duties had not altered, but their perception of the prisoners had. Some reported feeling uneasy when enforcing orders, recalling the visible distress of the women during the incident. For a few, empathy began to outweigh indifference. In small, often unrecorded gestures, an extra moment to explain an order, a softer tone of voice, averted eyes during inspection. Human decency found its way through the rigid structure of military protocol. These subtle acts did not undermine discipline, but rather infused it with a rare sense of conscience. Higher command monitored the situation closely. Reports circulated emphasizing the camp's continued compliance with international standards and the absence of unrest. The official tone was reassuring, projecting an image of order and professionalism. Yet internal correspondence hinted at deeper concern. The shower incident had become a case study within military administration, cited as an example of how emotional and cultural factors could affect camp stability. Psychologists and chaplains stationed nearby were quietly encouraged to observe prisoner morale and offer guidance to officers, marking one of the earliest recognitions of psychological welfare as an operational consideration in POW management. Meanwhile, the German women adapted. They began to establish small routines of comfort, sharing soap rations, sewing patches on worn clothing, exchanging brief notes of encouragement. These micro acts of care carried immense emotional weight, providing a counterbalance to the institutional rigidity surrounding them. In one recollection, a prisoner described how a fellow inmate hummed a lullaby before each inspection, a gesture that reminded them of home and softened the weight of captivity. The human spirit, though subdued, found quiet ways to persist. For historians, the aftermath of the shower incident reveals more than administrative adjustments. It captures the evolving relationship between occupier and captive, authority and vulnerability. The American military's response reflected a pragmatic blend of humanitarian concern and operational necessity, while the prisoners' endurance illustrated the resilience of dignity under duress. In retrospect, this moment became emblematic of the broader challenge facing all camps during the war: how to maintain control without extinguishing humanity. By the end of the month, Camp Hereford functioned smoothly once more, its routines restored, its reports orderly. Yet beneath that surface of compliance, the emotional residue of the incident remained, shaping behavior, trust, and perception in ways no regulation could erase. The camp story, when examined through this lens, is not merely one of discipline and hygiene. It is a reflection on the fragility of dignity in systems built on obedience. Years after the war's end, the events at Camp Hereford would resurface in oral histories, academic studies, and the private recollections of those who lived through them. What had once been a single distressing day in 1944 gradually took on symbolic meaning, representing both the psychological complexity of captivity and the moral intricacies of Allied conduct during the war. The story of the shower incident became a quiet case study in how small acts, orders, gestures, misunderstandings could ripple through the human experience of war far beyond the battlefield. When the war ended in 1945, most of the German prisoners at Camp Hereford were repatriated in waves. The women, who had once felt reduced to nameless figures behind barbed wire, returned to a devastated homeland. Their memories of Texas remained vivid. Many recounted the sharp contrast between the war-torn cities of Germany and the serene plains of the American Southwest. The camp, despite its restrictions, had offered food, shelter, and structure, but it had also imposed a form of emotional exile. For some, the moment of being ordered to shower in front of armed men became a defining fragment of that exile, one that reappeared in dreams and recollections decades later. In Germany's post-war years, women's testimony slowly began to emerge, though they often went unheard amid the broader narratives of reconstruction and guilt. The story of female POWs conflicted with prevailing perceptions of German womanhood at the time, roles defined by motherhood, domestic rebuilding, and silence. Yet historians, particularly from the 1980s onward, began to recognize the importance of these testimonies in reconstructing the social history of captivity. They discovered in them not only the trauma of imprisonment, but also the quiet resilience of women navigating moral and emotional survival within rigid systems of control. For American historians, the Hereford episode offered a mirror to their own wartime ethics. The U.S. military's treatment of POWs was widely regarded as humane compared to Axis camps, but the shower incident revealed the limits of that moral clarity. It underscored how even well-intentioned systems could inadvertently reproduce the same power dynamics they sought to transcend. In training manuals and post-war studies, officers and scholars began to emphasize cultural understanding as a critical component of humane administration, a lesson drawn directly from cases like Hereford. The material remnants of Camp Hereford slowly disappeared. The barbed wire rusted. The barracks were dismantled or repurposed, and the surrounding land returned to civilian use. Yet traces lingered: concrete foundations, fragments of soap dishes, faded graffiti in German etched into the walls. In 1995, local historians and residents organized a small commemorative exhibit displaying photographs, letters, and translated diary excerpts from the camp's archives. Among them was a short handwritten line from an anonymous female prisoner. "We were not angry. They did not know what this meant to us." That sentence encapsulated the haunting simplicity of the event: misunderstanding, power, and emotion intertwined within the machinery of war. The psychological consequences of such episodes also contributed to a broader reevaluation of wartime trauma. Researchers studying POW experiences began to link emotional responses like those at Hereford to the early conceptual framework of what would later be termed post-traumatic stress. The women's breakdowns during the showers were not isolated emotional outbursts. They were deeply human reactions to powerlessness, loss of control, and cultural dissonance. Their tears, viewed through the lens of modern psychology, represented a moment when suppressed trauma surfaced under the weight of order. In popular memory, the story of German women prisoners in Texas never reached the fame of major battles or political decisions. It existed instead on the margins of history, quiet, uncomfortable, yet undeniably human. It reminded later generations that war does not end at the signing of treaties or the silencing of guns. It continues in the memories of those who lived through its smaller, more intimate forms of suffering and endurance. By the early 21st century, Camp Hereford had become a subject of local heritage tours and academic essays, not as a site of atrocity, but as a place where human fragility met bureaucratic routine. Visitors walked through the fields where barracks once stood, guided by signs that spoke of rules, rations, and daily life. Few could imagine the emotional intensity that once filled those spaces. The sound of running water, the echo of orders shouted in English, and the quiet sobs of women caught between obedience and despair. And yet, it is precisely in such moments, small, transient, and easily forgotten, that history finds its truest reflection. The Hereford showers, remembered through documents and testimony, became not just a story of German women or American soldiers, but of humanity under pressure, how it bends, breaks, and sometimes quietly endures. The story of the German women prisoners at Camp Hereford stands as a quiet testament to the unseen dimensions of war. It was not a tale of armies clashing or nations rising and falling, but of individuals, ordinary women, caught between the rigid machinery of military order and the fragile architecture of human dignity. In that narrow, concrete shower hall, the boundaries between victors and vanquished blurred for a moment. Both the prisoners and their guards were confronted with the same truth, that control, when stripped of empathy, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty, even when executed in the name of duty. History often remembers wars through their grand narratives, battles, treaties, and leaders. But beneath those headlines lies a different history, one written in quieter places. Camps, hospitals, barracks, and the small human exchanges that define them. The Hereford incident reminds us that the moral legacy of a conflict is shaped as much by these moments as by its victories. The order to shower was not an act of malice. It was a collision between cultures, protocols, and pain. Yet it revealed how thin the line can be between discipline and dehumanization, and how quickly compassion can dissolve under the weight of uniformity. In the decades that followed, this story found its place not through accusation, but through remembrance. It taught military historians the importance of context, cultural sensitivity, and psychological understanding. It reminded future generations of soldiers that humanity must remain the final principle of command. And for those who read the diaries and letters of the women who wept that day, it offered a quieter, more universal lesson, that dignity is not merely a privilege of freedom, it is a need, as fundamental as safety or sustenance. Standing today on the open plains of Texas, where the barracks of Camp Hereford once stood, there is little left to see. Just wind through the grass, a few fragments of concrete, and the weight of memory. Yet in that emptiness, one can still feel what history cannot erase. The echo of running water, the silence that followed, and the enduring question it left behind. What does it mean to remain human, even in the simplest moments, when the world has forgotten how?